Hi everybody, thanks for joining us again. This is the second in our series of 3 talks for Marriage and Family Sunday in the Archdiocese of Canberra-Goulburn. So thanks for joining us. Today I'm going to introduce to you a lovely couple who are local to Canberra. Their names are Helena Zobec and Richard Marsen, and they've been involved for many years in a wonderful ministry called Ministry to the Newly Married. So before I tell you about their topic, I just want to tell you a little bit about Ministry to the Newly Married. It operates in a number of dioceses, and what happens is that newly married couples in their first 5 years of marriage have the opportunity to be mentored by couples with at least 10 years experience of marriage. So if you were a newly married couple in our archdiocese, you would be paired up with a more mature couple. You would meet with them 4 times over the first year of your marriage. The next year you would meet with a different couple for the next year of your marriage, up until 5 years. So that means for the first 5 years of your marriage, you've experienced 5 different marriages from people who are very committed to their marriages, and you've been introduced to 20 topics that are really known to be very important in those early years of marriage. So I think it's a really wonderful ministry. If you don't know anything about it, you might want to get involved as a mentor couple, or if you're a newly married couple, you might like to get involved to be mentored yourself. So that's Ministry to the Newly Married. Helena and Richard have worked in that ministry for many, many years. Helena is the Chief Librarian at the ACU in Canberra, and Richard is a policy officer in the Australian Public Service, and they have both shared for the whole 35 years of their marriage a very deep passion for motorcycling. So the topic they're going to speak to you about is the 5 love languages. So the 5 love languages is a thesis that was developed by Dr. Gary Chapman. He's a counsellor, and he noticed that even amongst parents and children and spouses that were really trying to love each other, there was often a difficulty or people missing the mark in their attempts to love each other. And he noticed that some people experience love more powerfully in different ways, and he developed 5 love languages. So Helena and Richard are going to speak to you about the 5 love languages and how they can help you in your relationship with your spouse, with your children, with your co-workers and friends. But before we begin, I want to get you thinking. So while Helena and Richard are talking, I want you to be thinking yourself about 3 questions, and you might like to type your answers in to the area below the video here. So the first question is, do you even accept this thesis? What experience have you had in your own life to support or contradict the thesis that what speaks powerfully of love to one person won't speak powerfully of love in the same way to another person? Have you seen evidence of that in your relationships? Another question I'd like to put to you is, do you have any experience yourself of using this knowledge that people experience love languages differently to try to communicate love to somebody in a way that wouldn't be natural to you? So instead of doing what's natural to you to love someone, have you learnt an experience that if you try something different to what comes naturally to you, it can actually minister a sense of love very powerfully to another person? If you've got any experiences to share of that, please also type those in. And the last one is, do you think that a person's primary love language can change over time? And without wanting to give you their whole talk, the 5 love languages that Gary Chapman identified is that some people experience feeling love through acts of service, some through words of affirmation, some through quality time, some through physical affection, and some through gifts. So again, just to repeat those 3 questions, have you had experience that confirms or contradicts this theory that people experience love differently? Have you had experience of using this knowledge to try to love somebody else a little bit better through loving them differently than the way you experience love? And do you think people's primary love language can change over time? So I'm going to hand you over now to Helena and Richard. And also, if you have any questions of Helena and Richard, we'll have a little Q&A at the end, so you can type in questions for them and see what opinions they have about questions you might have. Thanks very much, and I'll hand you over to Helena and Richard now.
Thanks, Lara, for that very kind introduction. Richard and I are going to share delivering this talk, and what we want to do is just give you an overview of the 5 love languages to start with, and then we'll go into more detail in the second part of it of each of the love languages. So, the desire for romantic love in marriage is deeply rooted in our psychological makeup and is across all cultures. Falling in love is an exciting but short-lived part of a long-term relationship. Research has shown that it lasts at most 2 years. Love that truly contributes to our spouse's emotional well-being is based on the decision to love. Successful relationships are based on each of the couple meeting their spouse in a more natural expression of bonding.
That's right. So people express and receive love in different ways. Dr. Gary Chapman, in his book, The 5 Love Languages, identifies these as the 5 languages of love. If you express love in a way your spouse doesn't understand, your love won't be shared nor understood as an expression of love because you're speaking essentially 2 different languages. Most of us instinctively reach out in love to others in the way that speaks most strongly of love to ourselves. We assume that if we feel loved by certain actions from our spouse, then they will also feel loved if we do the same for them. Perhaps one of you needs to hear encouraging words after a hard day at work, but your partner feels other actions, such as cooking you a nice dinner, will cheer you up. When you still feel down, the cook is left wondering why. Or again, your spouse may crave time together, quality time, away from the busyness of life to be with each other. Yet the gift you brought home is not received in the way it was intended.
So choosing to love your spouse the way they need to be loved has far greater impact. It's far better to put our energy into gestures that speak the love language that will be heard and understood by our spouse. Discovering the primary love language of our spouse is essential to keep their emotional tank full. Keeping our emotional love tanks full is as important to a marriage as a healthy diet is to our bodies. Running your marriage on an empty love tank has far greater long-term cost than most of us realise. Empty love tanks can lead to couples withdrawing from each other. A full love tank creates a climate of love, understanding and a solid basis to good communication, allowing differences and positive negotiation on how to support those differences.
No single area of marriage is as greatly impacted as meeting the emotional need for love. When our spouse's emotional love tank is full and they feel content in a loving marriage, they will reach their highest potential in life. So a state of emotional contentment results in keeping our marriages exciting and growing.
There are some basic but essential questions we need to ask to discover our primary love language. What makes you feel the most loved? And what hurts you deeply? Answers to these and other questions provide the critical clues in understanding your spouse's primary love language. According to Dr. Gary Chapman, there are 5 emotional love languages, 5 ways that spouses express and understand emotional love for each other. The most important thing is to speak the love language of your spouse.
So what are those 5 love languages? Firstly, words of affirmation, which Dr. Chapman describes as encouraging words, kind words, and humble words. Secondly, quality time, as we heard before, focused attention, quality conversation and activities, and even, in a sense, learning to talk. Thirdly, receiving gifts, which is not quite what you might think. It's not mere materialism or consumerism for its own sake, but it's a way of showing your love by giving or the person receiving gifts. Fourthly, acts of service, which Chapman talks about in terms of responding to requests rather than demands or imposed by feelings of guilt. And lastly, physical touch, which again is not necessarily what you might think. It's more than just intimate touching. There's touch that brings you pleasure may not also bring the same pleasure to your spouse. So it's a matter of learning these languages. So Helena and I will now explain each of the love languages briefly. Before we do that, I'll just mention there is a website that you can go to find out a bit more detail about it, and we'll have that on a slide at some stage. This website also has access to a free 2-minute questionnaire you can do to find out your own love languages and that of your spouse, the primary and secondary love languages. Or alternatively, you could always read the book because it's available everywhere.
Okay, so now we'll cover each of the 5 love languages and we're going to share that. So the first one is words of affirmation. So what are words of affirmation? Verbal compliments and words of appreciation are powerful communicators of love. They don't have to be written in poems or fancy speeches. On the contrary, the simpler and more straightforward the statement of affirmation, the better. Even if it isn't your spouse's primary love language, it's always good to be appreciated. Richard and I usually compliment each other on something just about every day. Even something as simple as thank you for making that cup of tea. Verbal compliments can be much better motivators than nagging or repetitive words. This doesn't mean using flattery to get your spouse to do something you want. The object of love is to do something for the well-being of your loved one and the relationship. Gary Chapman refers to the different types of words of affirmation as dialects of love language. Another dialect is encouraging words. Richard and I are often encouraging each other, usually when our confidence flags, or we're having a lot of hassles at work, or even setbacks in life generally, which we've had a lot of over the last few years. Above all, we need to use kind words, words spoken with kindly tones. The manner in which we speak is extremely important. To quote an old saying, a soft answer turns away anger. And one of my favourite quotes from Mother Teresa, be kind to each other. It is better to commit faults with gentleness than to work miracles with unkindness. So another dialect of love language of words of affirmation is humble words. Love makes requests, never demands. When making our needs and desires known in the form of a request, we're guiding our spouse, as opposed to delivering an ultimatum. Richard always says that I'm very good at phrasing what I would like done in the form of a gentle request. For example, do you think it might be possible to finish transplanting the pot plants this weekend? So that's words of affirmation, short and sharp. Secondly, we're moving on to quality time. Quality time means giving your spouse undivided attention, talking to them while maintaining eye contact, doing something they enjoy doing, and doing it wholeheartedly. Over the last few years, we started to go to the movies after work. Richard's secondary love language is quality time together, and this worked for us with our busy jobs. Previously, when we lived in a rural environment, we used the shared drive to and from work to spend this as quality talk time in the car. But you don't have to spend money going out. Just going for a walk together can be enough, as long as it's done regularly. Focused attention is the key dialect of this love language, which is all too easy to dilute with the many distractions we have nowadays, be they young children, mobile phones, other devices, or even television. Another dialect of quality time Gary Chapman calls quality conversations. By this, he means sympathetic dialogue where two individuals share their experiences, thoughts, feelings and desires in a friendly, uninterrupted context. One of the things Richard had to learn is not to interrupt. I used to feel undervalued by Richard, never letting me finish what I was saying. So once we came to that agreement, everything improved. Okay, so the third love language is receiving gifts. According to Gary Chapman, gift giving is an expression of love that transcends cultures. Most weddings include the mutual giving and receiving of rings as symbols of a couple's love. Gifts don't have to be expensive. They can be found, purchased, or even made. Having said this, if your spouse's primary love language is gifts, you may have to revisit how you spend your money. It's fine if you have the income to support making yourself feel good, but when your resources are shared, you may need to think about how to best balance spending and saving in that context. After all, we don't want to create a situation where one spouse feels emotional resistance to the idea of spending money as an expression of love. But when you think about it, if your spouse's love language is receiving gifts, then buying or making them is one of the best investments you can make, because you're meeting their emotional needs and filling their emotional love tank. There is also the gift of self. Being there when your spouse needs you, particularly in times of crisis. Your physical presence becomes the symbol of your love. This speaks clearly to one whose love language is receiving gifts. So for Richard, who scores for both quality time and receiving gifts are very close, he tells me having me around is important for him.
Exactly. Now I am going to interrupt. The fourth language, acts of service. I pretty early on in the marriage cottoned on that Helena's primary love language was acts of service. Now that was a long time before Gary Chapman published this book, and that gives a hint of, it was 1992 when he published that, so it gives a hint of how long we've been married. So by acts of service, Gary Chapman means doing things you know your spouse would like you to do. They don't have to be big projects or huge long-term jobs, but it can be simple everyday things like household chores, we mentioned the cup of tea before, or errands, little things just to help out. But they do require thought, some planning, time, and a little bit of energy. And if done with a positive spirit, they are real expressions of love. And they don't have to be spontaneously thought of by the person doing the acts. Obviously, you can't all be expected to be a mind reader, so sometimes requests will be made. To recap what we said earlier about words of affirmation, requests can give direction to love, whereas demands stop the flow of love. Like the other love languages, acts of service has its dialects. There are times when the spouse doing the acts of service might feel like a doormat. You sometimes need to do for your spouse what is important to them and not do it out of fear or guilt or resentment. Manipulation by guilt is not the language of love, nor is coercion by fear. As we said before, Helena has a very gentle knack of asking very kindly or reminding me to do things, pot plants and others. Lastly, physical touch. Physical touch and its capacity to communicate the range of emotions, or the whole spectrum from love to hate, is very, very strong, particularly for people for whom that's their primary language. It can make or break a relationship. So to the spouse whose love language is physical touch, the message in a gentle hug will be received much more strongly than spoken words of "I love you." That said, some touches will bring more pleasure to this particular spouse than other touches. Remember, the touch that brings pleasure to you may not bring the same pleasure to your spouse. Dr. Chapman describes explicit and implicit love touches. Explicit being focused touches such as marriage, massages or expressions of intimacy, and implicit touches being more subtle, brief, but requiring a little bit more thought. For example, simply touching your spouse on the arm as you walk past them in the room, or holding hands whilst going for a walk. Again, quite simple acts. Another kind of touch is in times of crisis. We all instinctively hug each other in moments of crisis because touch is such a powerful communicator of love. All marriages will experience crises, and the most important thing you can do for your spouse at those times is to demonstrate your love for them. So, for example, if your spouse's love language is touch, nothing is more important than holding them as they are crying. Okay, that finishes our broad overview of the book. There's much more detail in it. However, we're happy to throw it open to some questions. And one that Helena and I discussed as we were preparing for this was, is it possible for one's primary and secondary love language to change over time? So we think it can do, just as other aspects of your personality and relationship can. So look forward to hearing some of your questions coming online. Thank you.
So thanks so much, Helena and Richard. That was great. So I think we heard that Helena's main love language is acts of service and Richard's is quality time and maybe gifts. So could you just share with us, do you both have two love languages or just the one? And how does that play out in your marriage in the way you try to love each other? Give us some practical examples of how you use that knowledge in your marriage.
Okay, so do we have primary and secondary love language each, and some practical examples how that plays out in our marriage? Okay, well, I did the questionnaire on the survey a few weeks ago just to refresh it in my mind, and I found out that my scores for receiving gifts and quality time were really high and close together, so most of my answers were tending to that. So in practical terms, that works out in the marriage so that if Helena thinks to buy me something that I need or even don't need sometimes from a catalogue, I really appreciate it and I feel loved in that way. And sometimes that coincides with spending quality time, because it then means we can discuss how we're going to use whatever widget it is, or we've started reading books out loud to each other. So that's a really nice way of sharing our love, and I feel really quite loved. And I'll let Helena talk to her love language.
Mine's very much clearly acts of service. I find that if Richard does something where it's self-initiated and it's something that saves me a task, or it helps me with something that I need to do further down the track, I'm incredibly appreciative. He will often look up things on the web saying, you mentioned the other day that you needed to know what X was. I found out you can get them from here, and here, and they're about $30. And that, it just really cuts into the task, and I'm really, really grateful for that sort of thing.
Like the roses we've been trying to buy to plant in our newly landscaped garden.
Yeah.
Just some of them are quite hard to find. So...
And in terms of secondary love language, mine would probably be touch, in the sense that I really like it if we're going for a walk and we hold hands or something like that. But over time, that's not been as important to me as it was when I was much younger. After, we've been together for over 35 years now. So for me, that's not as important as acts of service. But I've been quite consistent with acts of service all throughout our marriage. But and I've tended to move much more to appreciating quality time with Richard.
Great. And how about you, Richard? Do you think there's been a change in emphasis, or has it been pretty consistent?
Has there been a change in emphasis or focus of my... Yes, I would say in my case, as well as Helena's. She just started to touch on I think when we were first married, I was very much a physical touch kind of language was my primary one. Gifts, not so much, because I was, we'd met when we were students, so we never had much money, so there wasn't much focus on that material side of things. I guess if there was any gift giving, it was the person of each other, being present for each other. So I guess, maybe going back to what I said earlier, the quality time was always important to me, but I didn't realise it then, maybe. So definitely, yes, I've shifted the primary one from touch more to the receiving of gifts. But I'll just comment on something Helena mentioned, that when she was younger, she used to like physical touch, hand holding and so on. Occasionally, you would have to remind me that you really appreciated being, have a little shoulder squeeze or touched in public when we're out together. And my cultural background, I guess, is a little bit more reserved. Yeah, thank you. Than Helena's, from our backgrounds are quite different. So, yeah, that was something I actually had to train myself to do in a sense.
Fantastic. And last question, if you were advising any couple who have been married for 30 years or just about to get married, how would they best go about trying to use this knowledge or get started with using this knowledge to enhance their relationship?
I'd definitely say do the questionnaire first, because it's freely and readily available. Because sometimes you actually don't know what your own love language is. And the other thing I'm thinking of is it's really important that you're aware of what your partner or your spouse's love language is, because if you want to communicate something positive with them, then you need to know how they're going to receive it most positively. Yeah, that would be my take on it.
Yeah, and if I can just jump in, how to advise a newly married couple embarking on marriage, how to put this set of tools into place would be reading the book if you get a chance. The website's a great start, definitely doing the questionnaire, as Helena said, but that'd be my advice to a couple interested in looking at setting out down this path. It's part of a toolkit you can use in your relationship to build a really loving, long-lasting marriage that will get past that initial 2-year rosy falling in love, and then, you know, the daily humdrum kicks in and things aren't quite so rosy. But if you've got a concept like the 5 love languages behind you, it's a really good start to your marriage.
And we'd also say never underestimate contentment.
Very good. Great note to end on. Thank you so much, and we'll throw it open to questions from people out there in computer land.
Lovely, thank you.
Thank you.
Helen and Richard, for all the time and effort you've put into preparing that for us. Can you hear me at the moment?
We can. Yeah? Can you hear us?
Yeah, so just looking into the Zoom camera, great. So what about for people who are thinking about using this knowledge for children or work colleagues? Do you think it's as applicable outside of your marriage relationship, or do you have any experience of using this knowledge outside of your personal relationship with each other?
Well, yes and no, but not directly using it as such. We're aware that since the first book of 5 Love Languages was published, like a lot of these popular books, they kind of expand their portfolio, Lara. So I believe there's one being published, the 5 love languages of children. I think there's another one of teenagers and quite possibly of work, but I've never personally used it in a work context. And I guess indirectly we used it with our daughter when she was growing up. But again, we've only kind of come to this set of tools relatively recently in the marriage. So, I mean, being aware of it as called the 5 love languages. So I'd certainly think it would be applicable for children and teenagers, yes. Workplace, possibly, but... Sorry?
I'm happy to answer the one about the workplace. I don't know that I've actually used it in the sense of it being a love language, but I've certainly I've applied the same principles to understanding how your staff communicate, or even in a client services area. If once you tap into what someone's preferred communication style is, then you can deliver the message in the way that they will receive it. Just repeating what you're saying doesn't mean they're necessarily going to be hearing it, so that they feel it's been comfortably answered, the inquiry.
Very good. I'm just checking the questions here. So we've had people definitely say that they feel that their love language has changed over time, as you indicated in your talk, which is great. And I guess just one reflection I have listening to you is it seems, even though this information is applicable to anybody of any persuasion, religious persuasion or whatever, it seems quite a Christian approach in that you're very much trying to love the other person in a selfless way. So not just relying on instinct or what works for you or makes you feel good. It's very, very other-centered, isn't it? So how would you just advise people to get started in their relationship with we did talk about the quiz, so you can go online, and we've put that in the comments. You can go online and do the quiz. Anything else, any other tips just for learning to notice the love languages of your children or your spouse, and get started on trying to love them in that sort of selfless way that works for them?
That's a good question, Lara. I'd actually, yes, I'd say that you do need to understand what your own is, and depending on the age of the children, whether they can do the questionnaire or not, so that you understand how they feel. I think it becomes more refined the more of an adult you become, so you actually can understand both your and others' love languages. But the success of it is it's all about communication, which is another huge component of ministry to the newly married. And it's about communicating in the way others hear best, rather than you just delivering your message, so to speak. Because communication is not just about the words, it's about how people feel. And feelings are neither right nor wrong, they just are. So it's really important to work through that part of communicating, I think, in terms of the message being delivered.
Yeah, I wouldn't have much to add to that, Helena. I think, yeah, that's good.
That's great. And so would you say the self-knowledge piece, what your main love language is important, so that you don't make assumptions that everybody's like me? And sometimes we don't even know what our own love language is. So for me, it's quality time. So I can assume that, me wanting to spend heaps of time with my husband is going to make him feel love, when actually it may not at all. So that piece of self-knowledge is important, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think based on what His Grace said at Mass before, it's not about me, it's about us. And another huge component of ministry to the newly married is it's about the we factor, and it's working together in order to have a successful relationship, which means taking into account each other's way of communicating.
And I guess if, in a nutshell, if a couple was wanting to start off down this road, they don't necessarily have to read the book or, go into any detail on it. They could just ask each other what makes them feel loved. It's a simple question like that.
Yeah, very. That's a bit straightforward, Richard. Just asking.
Just ask, yeah. Well, it's funny.
And also, I guess, providing feedback. I think women can be guilty of thinking, well, he should just know, if he loves me, he should just know what makes me happy. But actually giving feedback and saying, hey, I think you talked about that a bit. Hey, that really made me feel nice when you did that. Or I'm really glad how you brought in the rubbish or did the plants. So giving feedback to your spouse helps them to understand what makes you feel loved as well.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, look, we're going to leave it there so we can let people go off and get their lunch. But just to let everybody know that, as I said, Helena and Richard are involved in ministry to the newly married, which is couples married 10 years or more, mentoring newly married couples who choose to get involved in the program. And any more information about the 5 love languages, you can Google. If you want to find out about ministry to the newly married, you can contact me, Lara Kirk, at the Archdiocese, and I'll send you through to the ministry to the newly married people. And next week, we're going to have our last in this series of 3 marriage enrichment sessions, and we'd love you to join us again after Mass next week. And thank you again, Helena and Richard.
You're welcome.
Yep, thank you. Bye.